The alarm blared in the tiny, cluttered apartment, jarring Sophie Walters awake. She squinted at the time. 4:45 a.m. Another day, another exhausting routine. She sighed deeply, throwing back the thin blanket and forcing herself out of bed. The room was cold, and her body ached. Every muscle cried out for more sleep, but she didn't have the luxury. Not when there were bills piling up, an eviction notice looming, and 2 children depending on her. Tiptoeing into the cramped kitchen, she tried to keep quiet. Little Liam and Ellie were still fast asleep, their small bodies curled up under a single blanket. The sight tugged at her heart. They deserved so much more than this, more than a tired mother who barely had the energy to smile some days. Today would be different, she promised herself as she brewed a weak cup of instant coffee. Today, she'd find a way to fix things. She'd call in that favor at the diner, maybe even pick up an extra shift at the laundromat if it meant keeping a roof over their heads for 1 more week. Sophie took a sip of the lukewarm coffee, her gaze falling on the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. Rent, electricity, school fees. And that was just the start. She clenched her jaw, fighting the surge of despair threatening to overwhelm her. She didn't notice the note at first. It was just a small, folded piece of paper, slipped under the door in the early morning hours. No signature, no address, just a few hastily scribbled words. I know you're struggling. Help is coming. Don't give up. Her heart skipped a beat. She glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching from the shadows, but the hallway outside was empty and silent. Help is coming? For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope sparked within her. But was it real, or just another cruel trick of fate? She didn't have time to dwell on it. The kids would be up soon, and she needed to get ready for her first shift. Crumpling the note in her hand, Sophie shoved it into her pocket and turned back to the reality of her life, a life that, for the moment, seemed as bleak as ever. But, as she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but wonder, who left the note, and what did it mean? Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. Sophie raced through the early morning chill, her breath forming small clouds in the frosty air. With every step, the weight of her reality grew heavier. She hated rushing like this, hated the way she had to wake up before dawn, hated that she barely saw her kids during the week. But what she hated most was the helplessness. She wasn't living, she was merely surviving. As she waited for the bus, Sophie absent-mindedly felt for the note in her pocket. Her fingers brushed against the crumpled paper, and a strange sensation washed over her. It was almost comforting. Could it be possible that someone out there really knew what she was going through? Don't give up, she whispered, repeating the words. They felt hollow, but she clung to them nonetheless. What else did she have? If hope was all she had left, she would hold on to it, no matter how fragile. The day at the diner was just like any other. Long hours on her feet, rude customers, and a boss who barely noticed her existence unless it was to scold her. She forced a smile for every order, offered a cheery thank you for every tip, no matter how small. But today, something was different. Hey, Sophie! A voice called from behind her as she wiped down the counter for the 3rd time that morning. She turned to see Paula, the other waitress on shift, leaning against the counter with a knowing smile. There's some guy at table 3 asking for you. Me? Sophie blinked, confused. She didn't get visitors, ever. Paula shrugged. Said your name specifically. Go on, I'll cover for you. Sophie hesitated, then made her way toward the far corner of the diner. A man sat there, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He looked out of place in the shabby little diner, like a businessman who had accidentally wandered into the wrong part of town. Can I help you? Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man looked up slowly, his gaze piercing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table toward her. What is this? She murmured, heart pounding. Open it, he replied, his tone calm, almost gentle. With trembling fingers, Sophie tore open the envelope. Inside was a check made out to her. No name, no address, just a figure that made her gasp. $50,000. Her head spun. Was this a mistake? Was someone playing a sick joke on her? "I don't understand," she stammered. "Who are you?" The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Let's just say, I'm someone who believes in second chances. But why me?" Sophie felt tears prickling at her eyes. "What do you want from me?" He paused, studying her intently. "All I want is for you to have a choice. Take this, and your life can change. But remember, nothing comes without a price." "What price?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. The man stood up, leaving the envelope on the table. "You'll find out soon enough," he said softly. "When the time comes, you'll have to make some difficult decisions. But I believe you have the strength to do what's right." And with that, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving Sophie standing there, stunned and shaking. The check felt heavy in her hand, almost burning her skin. What was she supposed to do? Who was this man, and what kind of decisions was he talking about? Questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was certain. Her life had just taken a turn she never saw coming. Sophie sat in her cramped living room that evening, staring at the check as if it were a bomb that might go off at any second. The kids were asleep in the next room, and the apartment was shrouded in silence. She had tried to go about her usual routine, but her mind kept drifting back to that man, his cryptic words, and the impossible sum of money now sitting in front of her. $50,000. It could pay off all her debts. It could cover rent for the next 2 years, put food on the table, maybe even allow her to go back to school and get a degree. It could change everything. But the man's warning echoed in her ears. Nothing comes without a price. Could she really take the money? What if it was dirty? What if this was some kind of trap? But then again, what choice did she have? "Mom!" Sophie jumped, turning to see her son, Liam, standing in the doorway, rubbing his eyes sleepily. "Hey, sweetie," she whispered, tucking the check into her pocket. "What are you doing up?" "Had a bad dream," he murmured, shuffling over to her. "Can I stay with you?" "Of course." She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. As she held him, Sophie's resolve hardened. She couldn't let fear stop her, not when her children's future was on the line. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but she didn't care. Pulling out her phone, she dialed the number that had been written on the back of the note. It rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call," the man said calmly. Sophie gripped the phone tightly, taking a deep breath. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm despite the fear churning in her gut. "I'll take the money." "Good," the man replied. "But remember, this is only the beginning. There will be more tests, and each one will challenge you in ways you can't imagine." Sophie swallowed hard. "I understand. Just tell me what I need to do." There was a pause, then the man's voice softened. "Live your life as you normally would. The first test will come when you least expect it." And then he hung up, leaving Sophie staring at her phone, heart racing. The next morning, Sophie awoke with a renewed sense of determination. For the first time in years, she felt something other than despair. It was a small, fragile thing, hope. She cashed the check that afternoon, her hands shaking as the teller handed her the receipt. $50,000 sitting in her account. It felt surreal, almost unreal, but it was true. She could breathe again, if only for a moment. But as Sophie walked out of the bank, a chill ran down her spine. She glanced around, half expecting to see the man in the suit watching her, but there was no one there, just the bustling crowd of people going about their day. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. Something was coming, and whatever it was, Sophie had a feeling it would test her in ways she never thought possible. Days passed without incident, and Sophie began to think that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. With the money from the check, she caught up on rent and paid off a few bills. The relief was overwhelming, and she finally allowed herself to breathe a little easier. But just when she was starting to feel secure, the first test arrived. It came in the form of an unexpected phone call one evening while Sophie was preparing dinner. The kids were busy with their homework in the next room, their quiet chatter a comforting background hum. She was chopping vegetables when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the number, frowning. She didn't recognize it. "Hello? Sophie?" A woman's voice came through, hesitant and strained. There was something eerily familiar about it. "Yes, this is Sophie. Who is this?" It's Lydia." Sophie froze, the knife slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the counter. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She hadn't heard that name, hadn't heard that voice, in years. "What do you want?" she whispered, heart racing. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need your help." Lydia's voice cracked. "Please, Sophie, I'm desperate." 1,000 emotions surged through Sophie at once. Anger, pain, betrayal. She hadn't spoken to her sister since the night Lydia walked out on her, leaving her alone with a mountain of debt and no support. They had been so close once, but Lydia had taken advantage of Sophie's trust, borrowing money that she never repaid, and then disappearing without a trace. "Why should I help you?" Sophie demanded, her voice shaking. "After everything you did?" "Because I'm your sister," Lydia replied quietly, "and because I have no one else to turn to." Sophie gripped the edge of the counter, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside her. "What do you want?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Lydia's next words shattered what little control Sophie had left. "I'm in town. Can we meet? Just for a coffee? Please, Sophie." Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, every instinct screaming at her to hang up, to cut Lydia off just like Lydia had cut her out. But she hesitated. What if this was the first test the mysterious man had spoken about? What if somehow this was connected to that fateful offer? Taking a deep breath, Sophie forced herself to respond. "Fine. Tomorrow at noon, at the cafe on 5th. Lydia let out a small, relieved sob. "Thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much. I'll see you there." The line went dead, and Sophie stared at her phone, her heart heavy with dread. What was she doing? Why was she giving Lydia a chance after all these years? But deep down, she already knew the answer. The man's words echoed in her mind. "The first test will come when you least expect it." She had to see this through, no matter how painful it would be. The next day, Sophie stood outside the cafe staring through the glass at the small figure huddled in a corner booth. Lydia looked broken. Her once vibrant hair hung limp around her shoulders, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something else. Fear, maybe? Sophie took a deep breath and pushed open the door, the little bell above it jingling softly. Lydia looked up as Sophie approached, and for a moment the two sisters just stared at each other. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of anger and unspoken words. Finally, Sophie slid into the seat across from Lydia, folding her hands on the table. "What do you want?" Lydia swallowed, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. I'm in trouble, Sophie. I messed up. I got involved with the wrong people." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "The wrong people? What are you talking about?" "Loan sharks," Lydia whispered, her gaze darting around the cafe nervously. They lent me money, and I thought I could pay it back, but things got out of control. Now they're threatening me. If I don't come up with $50,000 by the end of the week, they're going to— 50,000? Sophie cut her off, her heart sinking. "That's the exact amount." She trailed off, realization dawning. The check, the mysterious man, the money she'd received. It was all connected, wasn't it? This was the test. Help Lydia or turn her away. "Please, Sophie," Lydia pleaded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know I don't deserve it, but you're the only one who can save me." Sophie leaned back, her mind racing. She thought of her own struggles, the years of pain Lydia had caused. Did she really owe her sister anything after all this time? But then she thought of her children, of the example she wanted to set for them. What kind of person did she want them to see her as? "Why should I trust you?" Sophie demanded, her voice cold. "How do I know you won't just disappear again?" Lydia shook her head frantically. I swear, I won't. I've changed, Sophie. I'm so sorry for everything I did. I know I can never make up for it, but please, if you ever cared about me even just a little, help me now." Sophie closed her eyes, her thoughts a whirlwind. This was it. This was the first real test. She could walk away right now and keep the money for herself, or she could help her sister, risking everything. Slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope with the remaining money. Lydia's eyes widened, and she let out a small gasp. "You're lucky I'm not doing this for you," Sophie said quietly, sliding the envelope across the table. "I'm doing it because I refuse to let hate define me." Lydia let out a choked sob, clutching the envelope to her chest. "Thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much. I'll pay you back, I swear." "Just stay out of trouble," Sophie murmured, standing up. She turned to leave, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "And don't contact me again. We're done." With that, she walked out of the cafe, feeling lighter than she had in years. She had passed the first test, but at what cost? The next morning, Sophie awoke to find another note slipped under her door. "You did well, but the tests are only going to get harder from here." Sophie stared at the note, a chill running down her spine. Harder? What could possibly be harder than forgiving the sister who betrayed her? But as she tucked the note into her pocket, she felt a strange sense of peace. Maybe, just maybe, she was stronger than she thought. For the first time in a long time, Sophie allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Whatever came next, she was ready. The following weeks were quiet, almost eerily so. Sophie's life settled into a new rhythm, and she began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: stability. The children were happier now that she wasn't constantly stressed and anxious. She had even started looking into evening classes at the local community college, thinking maybe, just maybe, she could finally pursue a degree in accounting, something she'd always dreamed about. But just as she was beginning to believe the worst was behind her, the next test came. It happened on a Monday morning. Sophie had just dropped off the kids at school and was heading to her second job at the laundromat when she noticed a sleek black car parked in front of her building. A man in a dark coat leaned against the car, his eyes locked on her. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Something about him seemed off. Dangerous. She hurried past, keeping her head down, but the man stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Sophie Walters?" he asked, his voice low and smooth. Sophie took a step back, her pulse racing. "Who are you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Mr. Hawk. I represent a business associate of Mr. Anderson." Sophie's blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I think you do." He pulled out a crisp white envelope and held it out to her. "This is for you, an offer, if you will." With trembling hands, Sophie took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "We know you passed the first test, but how far are you willing to go? There's a man named David Carson who has been stealing from his employees for years, leaving countless families in ruin. We need you to expose him. Do this, and you will be rewarded. Fail, and your current good fortune will be revoked. Completely." Sophie's stomach twisted. Expose a man for theft? She wasn't a detective. How could she possibly pull something like that off? And why her? "This must be some kind of mistake," she stammered, shaking her head. I can't do this." Mr. Hawk's smile vanished. "I assure you, it's no mistake. You've been chosen, Sophie. You have until the end of the month. Do it, or everything you've gained, your money, your stability, even your children's future, will be taken from you." Sophie's heart pounded. "That's blackmail." "Call it what you like," Mr. Hawk said with a shrug. "The choice is yours." Before she could respond, he turned and slipped back into the car. The engine roared to life, and then he was gone, leaving Sophie standing there, clutching the envelope in disbelief. She glanced around, half expecting to see Mr. Anderson lurking in the shadows, watching her. But the street was empty. What the hell was she supposed to do? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sophie went through the motions at work, her mind racing. Exposing a corrupt businessman? It sounded like something out of a movie. She was just a single mom. What did she know about uncovering crimes? But if she didn't do it, everything she'd worked for would be destroyed. That evening, after putting the kids to bed, Sophie sat down at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She typed in David Carson and hit search, hoping for some clue about who he was and what she was dealing with. The results were immediate. David Carson was the CEO of a medium-sized company called Carson Holdings, specializing in construction and real estate. He was known for his flashy lifestyle, luxurious homes, and extensive charity work. On the surface, he looked like the picture-perfect businessman. But Sophie dug deeper, reading article after article. There were whispers, rumors that Carson was exploiting his workers, paying them a fraction of what they were owed, and siphoning off funds to line his own pockets. Several former employees had tried to sue him, but none of the cases ever went anywhere. Carson had a reputation for being untouchable. Sophie leaned back, rubbing her temples. How could she possibly take down someone like him? She didn't have resources, connections, or even a basic understanding of law. What was she supposed to do? Call the police and say, "Hi, I'm a random stranger, but I think this guy's a crook." But as she stared at the screen, an idea began to form. It was risky, possibly even illegal, but what choice did she have? If she was going to expose Carson, she needed proof. She needed someone on the inside. The next day, Sophie called in sick at work and drove to Carson Holdings' main office. It was a sleek, modern building in the heart of downtown, all glass and steel. Sophie's nerves buzzed as she parked across the street, watching employees file in and out. She didn't have a plan, just a vague idea that she needed to talk to someone who worked there, someone who might be willing to speak out. But who? Sophie's gaze drifted to a young woman standing by the entrance, staring down at her phone with a tired expression. She looked about Sophie's age, maybe a little younger, with a neat ponytail and a slight slump to her shoulders that screamed exhaustion. Taking a deep breath, Sophie got out of the car and approached her. "Excuse me," she said softly. The woman glanced up, eyes wary. "Do you work here?" "Yeah," the woman replied cautiously. "Why?" Sophie hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I need your help. I know this sounds crazy, but I think your boss, David Carson, is stealing from his employees, and I'm trying to stop him." The woman's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "Are you insane? Who are you?" "My name is Sophie," Sophie said quickly. "I'm not a reporter or anything. I'm just trying to do the right thing." The woman stared at her for a long moment, then glanced around nervously. "Look, I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. If anyone sees you talking to me, I could get fired. Or worse." "Please," Sophie pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. "I need proof. If you know anything at all, just tell me and I'll leave you alone." The woman bit her lip, glancing around again. Then, to Sophie's surprise, she leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "There's a file," she murmured. "Carson keeps it in his office. A ledger of all the off-the-books payments he's made, but no one's ever been able to get close enough to see it. If you really want to expose him, that's what you need." Sophie's heart raced. "How do I get it?" "You don't," the woman hissed. "You'd have to break into his office, and trust me, security's airtight. If you get caught—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Just forget it, okay?" With that, she turned and hurried into the building, leaving Sophie standing there, stunned. A ledger. A file that could prove everything. All she had to do was get it. But how? And could she really pull something like that off? That night, Sophie sat in her apartment, staring at the notes she'd scribbled down after her encounter with the woman. A plan was forming in her mind. Crazy, reckless, and probably suicidal, but a plan nonetheless. If she could somehow get into Carson's office and find that ledger, it would be over. She could expose him, bring him down, and pass the second test. But the stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. Taking a deep breath, Sophie picked up her phone and dialed the number Mr. Hawk had left her. "I'll do it," she said softly when he answered. "But I need your help." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Of course, Ms. Walters. We've been expecting your call." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Mr. Hawk arranged everything: a fake employee ID, a uniform, and detailed blueprints of the building. Sophie felt like she was in a spy movie. Her nerves wound so tightly that she could barely sleep. But there was no turning back now. She had to finish what she'd started. On the night of the heist, Sophie walked into Carson Holdings like she belonged there. Her heart hammered in her chest as she swiped the fake ID at the employee entrance. The card reader blinked green, and the door buzzed open. She was in. The building was quiet, most of the employees long gone for the night. Sophie kept her head down, her eyes scanning the hallways for security cameras. She took the service elevator to the top floor, where Carson's private office loomed at the end of a dimly lit corridor. As she approached the door, Sophie's breath caught. This was it. If she got caught now, it would all be over. The lock on the door was sophisticated, but Mr. Hawk had given her a small device that bypassed the system in seconds. The door clicked open, and Sophie slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. Carson's office was huge. Plush carpets, expensive artwork, and a massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the room. But Sophie ignored all of it. Her eyes were locked on the file cabinet in the corner. She rushed over, her fingers trembling as she rifled through the drawers. Minutes passed, and panic began to rise in her throat. What if the ledger wasn't here? What if it was all for nothing? Then her hand brushed against something thick and bound in leather. She pulled it out, holding her breath. The ledger. With shaking hands, Sophie flipped it open. There it was, page after page of incriminating entries. Payments siphoned off to offshore accounts, bribes to city officials, and wages stolen from his employees. This was it, the proof she needed. She snapped photos of every page with her phone, her pulse racing. As she slipped the ledger back into the drawer, she heard it, the soft click of a door opening behind her. Sophie spun around, her heart dropping into her stomach. David Carson stood in the doorway, his eyes cold and furious. Well, he murmured, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. What do we have here? Sophie's mind raced. How had he known? Had he been tipped off? She took a step back, her back hitting the cold metal of the file cabinet. You really think you can take me down? Carson sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You're just a nobody, a pathetic little single mom who should have stayed in her place. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. I don't want to fight you, Carson. I just want you to pay for what you've done. Carson's expression darkened. You have no idea what you're dealing with. One phone call and you'll lose everything, your job, your kids, your freedom. Sophie's stomach churned, but she lifted her chin. You're not as powerful as you think. I have copies of this ledger. If anything happens to me, they'll go public. Carson's eyes narrowed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he chuckled softly. Very clever, he murmured. All right then. You want to play hardball? I'll make you an offer. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. What offer? Carson leaned against the desk, his gaze never leaving hers. You destroy those copies and walk away. In return, I'll give you $100,000, enough to take care of your kids, pay off your debts, and never have to worry about money again. Sophie's hands clenched into fists. $100,000. It was more than she could ever hope for, but it was blood money. Money stolen from people just like her, people who were struggling, desperate, trying to survive. Or, Carson continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, you refuse, and I'll make sure your life is a living hell. You'll lose everything. Your children will grow up without a mother. Sophie stared at him, her pulse pounding. She could end this right now. Take the money and walk away. Her kids would be safe, secure. It would be so easy. But then she thought of all the families Carson had destroyed, all the people who had suffered because of him. Taking a deep breath, Sophie stepped forward, her gaze steady. No, she said quietly. I'm not taking your money. I'm going to expose you. Carson's smile vanished. For a moment, pure rage flashed in his eyes, but then he straightened, his expression smoothing into one of cold indifference. So be it, he said softly. You've made your choice. Before Sophie could react, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and the office door swung open. Two burly security guards stepped inside, their expressions grim. "Escort Ms. Walters out," Carson ordered, "and make sure she never sets foot in this building again." The guards seized Sophie's arms, dragging her toward the door. She struggled, but it was no use. As they hauled her out of the office, she twisted around, glaring at Carson. "You're going down, Carson," she spat, "one way or another." Carson just smiled. "Goodbye, Sophie. It was nice knowing you." The next few days were a blur. Sophie stayed glued to her phone, waiting for some sign that Carson was making good on his threats. But nothing happened. No police, no custody battles, no mysterious men in suits showing up at her door. It was almost worse than the threats. The waiting, the not knowing. What was Carson planning, and why hadn't he retaliated yet? Then, one morning, a new letter arrived. No envelope, no stamp, just a single sheet of paper slipped under her door. "You passed the test." Sophie's hands shook as she read the note. Passed. But how? She had lost everything, her chance to take down Carson, the money, her peace of mind. But then she saw it. At the bottom of the note, in neat, elegant handwriting, were 3 words that made her heart stop. "Check your account." With trembling fingers, Sophie opened her banking app. The balance blinked on the screen, and Sophie's jaw dropped. $200,000. Transferred anonymously. She sank onto the couch, staring at the screen in disbelief. It didn't make any sense. Why would Mr. Anderson reward her for failing? Then it hit her. She hadn't failed. She had made the hardest choice, to do the right thing, even when it meant losing everything. And Mr. Anderson had recognized that. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched the phone to her chest. She had passed the test. She had done it. And now, for the first time in her life, she had the means to build a better future for her children. A future where they wouldn't have to struggle like she had. A year later, Sophie stood in front of a small but bustling community center. She had used the money to start a non-profit organization dedicated to helping single mothers like herself, women who were struggling, fighting to make ends meet, just like she had once been. As she watched a group of young mothers walk through the doors, their children in tow, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace. She had done it. She had turned her pain into something beautiful, something that would help others. And as she stood there, watching her dream come to life, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them. Because she was no longer the struggling single mom who thought she had no power. She was Sophie Walters, a survivor, a fighter, and a beacon of hope for those still struggling in the dark. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring and suspenseful stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update. What would you have done in Sophie's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you know someone who'd love this story, share it with them. See you in the next video.